In today's special program from London University, Dr. Joseph Maiolo will present as a special speaker. His specialties in the World War II history and the 20th century cultural evolution competition and the arms race in the Second World War, 1931 to 1941, and arms race international politics from the 19th to the 24th century, and also the Cambridge history of the Second World War and going to, and the ideology, and so on. In today's special program, the World War II as a global history is the title of his presentation. We'd like to invite Professor Maiolo, please. Dr. Maiolo, please.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation and kind introduction, and this opportunity to reflect on the global history as an approach and the Second World War. And it's given me plenty to think about, and I hope my paper provokes some discussion of actually what global history is. And certainly over the past 30 years, one of the most significant trends in historical writing has been the rise of global history. Global history emerged in the optimistic 1990s, a period marked by the end of the Cold War, global market integration, and the digital communications revolution. The emergence of the global turn, as it's often called in historical studies, stemmed from the idea that economic globalization had played a central role in shaping the modern world, and that economic globalization had played a fundamental role in shaping the modern world, and that the traditional focus on the nation state was insufficient to capture that process's complexity. Looking beyond the nation state, global historians turned their attention to transnational phenomena, particularly the cross-border circulation of people, ideas, and goods. The rise of global history sparked a new wave of scholarship about capitalism, colonialism, the maritime world, migration, the history of science, technology, and ideas. And these traditional subjects had always been previously studied within a national context or, at best, in a comparative framework. Historians of the world wars were initially slow to take up the challenge of the global perspective. But that began to change with the centenary of the First World War, which sparked a new wave of global histories of that conflict. And those works re-examined the conflict through the global lens, showing that the world economy and that the colonial empires were central not only to the war's origins, but also to its outcome. Together, they highlighted the interconnectedness of the 20th century world. A similar shift is now underway in the study of the Second World War. Recent scholarship, along with events like this, and one we had at King's College a few months ago, marking the 80th anniversary since the war's end, are beginning this re-examination, reflection, and reinterpretation of the conflict of the Second World War from a global perspective. Now, one of the most significant benefits of the global turn in historical scholarship has been the move away from the Eurocentrism that had shaped earlier generations of research. Now, I still remember as a PhD student nearly 30 years ago at my first big international conference on the Second World War at the London School of Economics, and I watched the leading historians in the field trying to fit the Asia-Pacific War into a narrative that was then dominated by the Hitler's war thesis. It felt like they were shoehorning a fundamentally different story into an ill-fitting framework. And at the time, the common solution was to treat the Asia-Pacific conflict, and particularly the Pacific War, as a mere adjunct to what was then often being described as the European Civil War. Today, however, historians often trace the Second World War's origins to the East Asian crises of 1931 or 37, and some even take it a step further, framing the two world wars as a single global 30 years war. In other words, a series of colonial, civil, and interstate conflicts connected by transnational ideological hatreds. This shift challenges the war's traditional European timeline and preoccupation with great power politics and diplomacy, while also deepening our understanding of the war's truly global dimensions and impact. For example, over the past 15 years, new research has shed light on South Asia's crucial role in the war, and the war's critical role in India's journey to independence. More broadly, if the circulation of people is a defining feature of globalization, then the wartime shipping of tens of thousands of colonial soldiers from remote villages in South Asia and Africa to distant battlefields stands as a striking example of war-induced global interconnectedness. Perhaps most importantly, recent work in the history of political thought shows that the dominant ideologies of the era emerged through transnational intellectual exchanges and conversations, and not within simply national contexts. Finally, economic historians have begun to explore how the war's disruptions to global supply chains and the institutions created to manage these disruptions helped to reconfigure post-war patterns of global trade. It is now widely agreed that a global approach to the Second World War reveals previously hidden dimensions. Beyond that, there's very little agreement. And what I therefore propose to do today in this presentation is set out a framework for what I think a global history of the Second World War should look like. Afterward, I will offer some reflections on the first half of the last century of globalization, which I believe speak directly to the challenges of our current era of global instability. To begin, it is important to consider the inherent limitations of global history as an approach that complicate its application to the study of the world wars. First, early pioneers of the global turn deliberately shunned traditional historical topics such as the state, diplomacy, and war. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, many scholars embraced the prevailing belief that globalization was a one-way process moving toward a more liberal and interconnected world at the expense of national territorial politics. From that perspective, the two world wars represented violent interruptions in a broader historical trajectory of global market integration and the consolidation of international institutions. In other words, war was excluded from what constituted global history. Second, global historians often prioritized revealing patterns of transnational connectivity and situating national events within a global context rather than addressing fundamental questions of causation. The framework I propose seeks to move beyond these two limitations. First, war should not be seen as a deviation from or reversal in the process of globalization. On the contrary, it is crucial to recognize that the world wars, and indeed the Cold War, were themselves powerful motors of globalization. It is equally important to recognize that globalization, like any other contingent historical process, is not linear. It does not move inevitably towards one single endpoint. Second, it is not enough for a global history of the Second World War to merely highlight global connections and movements without exploring how globe-spanning structures and forces acted as causes. It should explain why organized political violence expanded on a worldwide scale in the 1930s and 40s and led to the deaths of over 60 million people, most of them were civilians, of course. To move beyond these two conceptual limitations, we must begin by addressing a fundamental question. What was the Second World War about? Rather than seeing it merely as a violent conflagration sparked by a series of loosely connected regional conflicts that disrupted the flow of globalization, I would argue that the war was ultimately a struggle over the institutions and hierarchy of international wealth and power. Structures that had been produced by globalization itself, and there's that relationship again. To explore how war and globalization interacted to intensify one another in the first half of the 20th century, I will focus on the dimensions through which globalization is commonly understood: people, ideas, and goods. I argue that the First World War was politically transformative across all three of these dimensions, and that recognizing these shifts is crucial to any truly global history of the Second World War. So let me begin with people. The American historian Eric Weitz argues that the period of peacemaking from 1919 to 1923 marked a consolidation and expansion in a new form of population politics. In this new world order, the international system moved away from the 19th century model of diplomacy based on dynastic legitimacy and territorial adjustments towards the management of entire populations defined by ethnicity, nationality, or race. The New World Order idealized sovereignty grounded in national homogeneity, while also enabling, as Weitz puts it, quote, while enabling, quote, entirely new ways of conceiving of politics. Now, one dimension of the new population politics in the 1920s is that the 1920s witnessed a marked tightening in immigration controls, the creation of legal categories for stateless persons, and the expansion of border regimes to regulate the movement of people more broadly. But the most significant innovations in population politics came at the international level, with the creation of the League of Nations. Among the League's roles was to administer the mandate system, through which former colonies of the defeated enemy powers were transferred to the control of the victorious powers. This control was legitimized by the rhetoric of a civilizing mission, which framed imperial governance as a humanitarian responsibility, according to which, quote, advanced mandatory states would guide the colonial populations towards national sovereignty at some ill-defined point in the future. A parallel development took place in the international protection of minorities within the newly formed successor states of Central and Eastern Europe. This Geneva-supervised legal regime offered only very limited safeguards to minorities, while simultaneously provoking deep resentment among national elites. Moreover, it permanently marked large minority populations as alien in the eyes of ultranationalists, rendering them vulnerable to ethnic violence once interstate conflicts erupted. Indeed, in its most violent form, the new population politics manifested itself as ethnic cleansing, or to use the term of the time, the unmixing of peoples. One of the clearest examples was the Lausanne settlement, which ended the Greek-Turkish War of 1919 to 1923. This agreement authorized an internationally supervised population exchange involving 1.5 million people, displaced solely based on their designated religion and ethnicity. As Weitz argues, the advent of population politics had a dual potential. On the one hand, it paved the way for the consecration of human rights by the United Nations in December of 1946. On the other hand, it enabled the extreme violations of those rights during and after the war. Those violations included genocide and the forced expulsions in Central Europe, and of course, blood-soaked partitions in Asia and Africa. The entangled history of population politics, human rights, and the violent pursuit of national homogeneity, and indeed its ongoing legacy, must be considered a central theme in any global history of the Second World War. Turning now to the realm of ideas, I think most historians would likely characterize the Second World War as a war of ideologies in an age of extremes. I do not dispute the importance of that perspective, which has been thoroughly researched and thoroughly studied. However, I believe it is important to move beyond the clash of ideologies and examine an intellectual transformation that I think had a truly global impact. That transformation, what the sociologist James C. Scott calls high modernism, was rooted in the belief that top-down state power, guided by scientific knowledge, could engineer ideal biological, material, and social conditions. It marked a sharp break from earlier traditions of political thought. Although high modernist thinking had multiple origins, Scott identifies the German industrialist Walter Rathenau, the architect of Germany's centralized war economy during the First World War, as a key originator of the idea. Historians often credit Rathenau's technocratic writings championing economic planning as the inspiration behind Lenin's vision of building socialism. Yet high modernist thinking was not confined to a single ideology. It extended across the entire political and intellectual spectrum. What united conservative and socialist planners was the shared belief that markets had to be regulated, not only to avoid economic instability, but also to prevent outcomes that conflicted with broader national or class interests. At its core, economic high modernism championed the use of statistical knowledge to enable technocratic rule through central planning. It embraced Taylorist principles of industrial efficiency and legitimized state interventions to coordinate and expand industries vital to national security. At the international level, the League of Nations partly fulfilled the expectations of some liberal planners by serving as a key source of reliable economic data designed to boost flows of international trade and investment. High modernist thinking also inspired state-building projects in post-imperial Turkey and in China, as well as colonial development projects in the British, French, Italian, and Japanese empires. During this period, demography took shape as a social science within the framework of high modernism, reflecting a growing recognition that global population shifts would influence future power dynamics. High modernism's emphasis on statistics and state planning concentrated government attention on managing national and imperial populations, driving a range of social reform, pro-birth, and also eugenics policies aimed at securing future generations of healthy soldiers, workers, and farmers. At its most extreme, and especially in the radical revolutionary regimes, the drive for population engineering and internal security became a justification, an intellectual framework, if you prefer, for mass detention, forced labor, and even mass murder. Ultimately, high modernism must be a central theme in the global history of the Second World War. It is essential not only for understanding the era's remarkable hubris, but also for explaining why the clash of ideologies mattered in the first place. Both were rooted in a trans-ideological conviction that rational planning and state power could engineer a radically different world. In this sense, high modernism served as the intellectual apparatus behind a war of violent extremes. Now, turning to the third element often associated with globalization, the flow of goods, what I want to focus on is simply one issue in a political economy, and that's raw materials or the flow of natural resources. As with population politics and high modernism, the era of the two world wars marked a turning point, one that brought questions of industrial raw material extraction, exploitation, and ownership to the center of world politics. It is during this period that the concept of the strategic mineral took shape, along with strategies of raw material supremacy and growing fears that dependence on foreign resources amounted to an intolerable form of limited sovereignty and strategic vulnerability. That transformation, what I call the advent of adversarial resource politics, was driven by two 19th century trends consolidated by the First World War, and particularly economic mobilization and economic warfare. So I'll go through those trends. The first trend was the rising belief among industrialist economists and state officials around the turn of the last century that the world was on the verge of being dominated by a few giant powers. Historian Sven Beckett has attributed the prevalence of that expectation to what he calls, quote, the territorialization of industrial capitalism, a process that linked a thriving industrial core to a resource-rich periphery through the foundation of an imperial state as the ideal sovereign unit. The second related trend was the rising recognition amongst political and industrial elites, and one might add scholars there as well, that mastery over global vertical frontiers of subsoil wealth, particularly mineral fuels and metals, was essential to sustaining and winning the race for modern military and industrial power. Now, before 1914, these trends raised concerns about globalization's impact on great power diplomacy, yet they did not break the legal and normative divide established in the late 19th century between transnational markets and inter-imperial rivalry. The First World War, however, fundamentally changed the relationship between cosmopolitan capitalism and state power. Prolonged industrial warfare forced the great powers to mobilize and control their economies through powerful state agencies which sought to maximize resource extraction from both their domestic and imperial territories. The race to mobilize people, finance, and material resources and to deny them to adversaries went global in the form of maritime blockades and the co-option of neutral countries into economic warfare. The Allies always had a clear advantage in productive power, especially after the United States joined the war in April 1917. But it was globalization before and during the war that turned this edge into real battlefield strength. Britain's pre-war position as the hub of global finance and maritime trade enabled the Allies to share the economic burdens of the war and harness the global economy to achieve victory. Indeed, the First World War's most consequential strategic innovation, replicated in the Second World War, was the Allies' elaborate system of intergovernmental committees to coordinate shipping, finance, food, fuel, and industrial inputs or raw materials, effectively transforming economic globalization into a weapon. The weaponization of the global economy paved the way for adversarial resource politics by fusing economics with strategy. This shift also reinforced the belief that a few large, integrated, self-sufficient blocs would ultimately rule the earth. Just like population politics and the prevalence of high modernist ambitions, adversarial resource politics became a core normative feature in international relations. While resources were not a direct cause of war, international tensions over them would shape the course and outcome of the Second World War. The post-1919 world order reflected the growing importance of resources in shaping international hierarchy. It was structured to reinforce the dominance of the big three Atlantic powers by shoring up their control over known sources of commercially exploitable fossil fuels, minerals, and other key commodities, as well as over, and this is the most important point, over the business and maritime infrastructure of global supply chains. Although some leading Allied officials advocating extending wartime controls over shipping and global markets into peacetime to formalize the victor's command of global resources, the collapse of the German and Austro-Hungarian empires made a formal economic security alliance unnecessary. The peacemakers, above all President Woodrow Wilson, preferred to keep the economic and military supremacy of the Western victors informal and latent rather than conspicuous and provocative. They viewed the return to global markets as essential in order to benefit from them in peacetime and to preserve the capacity to weaponize them again should the need arise. Even so, key features of the 1920s world order made this supremacy unmistakable. Article 16 of the League of Nations Covenant, for instance, formalized the use of economic sanctions against an aggressor, an explicit example of resource dominance being used as a tool of deterrence in support of the new liberal order. The emerging resource hierarchy was also further reinforced in the post-war naval disarmament treaties, which famously fixed the hierarchy of naval power in favor of the top three victors. And though ultimately unsuccessful, League-sponsored disarmament talks also pointed in a similar direction. Had they succeeded, world disarmament would have cemented a structural advantage of for the resource-rich, industrially advanced powers in mobilizable military power. Of course, the peace settlements of the 1920s failed to resolve the deeper tensions caused by the uneven global distribution of natural resources and limited commercial access to them. Before long, Washington and London found themselves in conflict over control of key commodities, namely oil, rubber, and copper, and also how to govern the flow of commodities worldwide. What became known as the, quote, raw material problem emerged as a recurring issue at the League of Nations. In Geneva, both Italy and Japan pushed for international agreements to guarantee equal access to industrial raw materials. For many commentators, though, the solution to the commercial and strategic vulnerabilities created by interdependence lay in two key goals: creating a global free market for natural resources through trade diplomacy. Most notably, that reached its pinnacle at the 1927 World Economic Conference in Geneva, and also, of course, in preventing great power war through disarmament. As you know, the Great Depression of the early 1930s shattered the global economy and brought the Geneva disarmament talks to an end. In the later half of the decade, however, the League of Nations became the focal point for debates on how to address the raw material problem and ease tensions between what commentators often referred to as the have and have-not powers. These debates, however, had little impact on the resource strategy of the great powers. British, French, and American officials saw their control over natural resources and their ability, and this is the more important point, their ability to weaponize the global interdependence again as key strategic advantages. This was especially true for their dominance of the maritime and business infrastructure that underpinned global supply chains. And indeed, they were right. As my colleague David Edgerton argues in his study of industrial raw materials and the world wars, although the Allies faced early military setbacks, they ultimately gained a self-reinforcing advantage. This self-reinforcing advantage stemmed from a vast resource base, their control over global commercial networks, and maritime dominance, combined with blockade, strategic bombing, and a coordinated economic strategy backed by U.S. industrial power. So, to just summarize what I've been arguing so far, I'm proposing a framework for understanding the global history of the Second World War that moves beyond seeing the world wars as mere interruptions to globalization. Instead, my approach highlights how war and globalization reshaped each other through three interconnected transformations: the rise of population politics, the soaring and often coercive ambitions of high modernist state engineering, and the emergence of adversarial resource politics. While these transformations did not directly cause the Second World War, they helped to explain the war's vast scale and the extreme violence with which the war was conducted, and particularly aimed at civilians. Now, to examine global causation, or causation at the global level, I will focus on two major developments: the Great Depression, which ruined efforts to restore liberal economic globalization in the 1920s, and the global arms race, which introduced and drove a new form of military globalization. I need not dwell on just how catastrophic the Great Depression was for world trade, or on the deep societal damage caused by the collapse of international commerce and financial flows. Today, the onset of the Great Depression is often invoked as a cautionary tale, used to argue that high tariffs, trade regulation, and industrial planning risk unraveling the fabric of globalization. However, some historians have begun to challenge the prevailing narrative that the Great Depression marked a reversal of globalization. They offer an alternative perspective in two ways, and I'll deal with the first. First, they argue that the Great Depression should not be seen merely as one in a series of cyclical crises in the history of capitalism. Instead, it marked the collapse of a specific post-1919 strategy of liberal imperial stabilization. As noted earlier, one pillar of that strategy was the resource supremacy of the Atlantic victors, but its central ambition was to construct a global market insulated from geopolitical tensions through a return to the gold standard and the removal of barriers to trade and investment. This vision of globalization was shaped not only by a liberal faith in the pacifying power of free trade, but also by a deeper strategic imperative to secure the dominance of the three Atlantic powers through growing economic interdependence. Before it spectacularly failed, however, there was plenty of evidence that this strategy was working. By the 1920s, Britain, France, and the United States produced nearly 60% of the world's manufactured goods, controlled about a third of global trade, supplied 85% of international capital, and held 60% of the world's global monetary reserve of global gold. As a striking example of how 1920s liberal globalization could contain even its challengers, the Soviet Union pegged its currency to gold. Because Moscow needed to sell grain on international markets in exchange for machinery, for technology, essential for building socialism and a modern military-industrial base. Managed by a network of central banks, the gold standard served to link national economies to the newly rebuilt international monetary system. In doing so, it promoted a vision of capitalism in which domestic economies were subordinated to an ostensibly neutral global order. Yet, as the 1930s would show, the danger lay in the system's ability to transmit monetary shocks across borders and, of course, impose severe austerity on national economies. One only need recall Japan's brief experiment with the gold exchange standard in 1930-31 to grasp the scale and force of that transmission. More broadly, the collapse of world trade and the fracturing of the global monetary system had far-reaching consequences. Across the world, the economic meltdown discredited liberal capitalism and parliamentary democracy, and it elevated into positions of political power politicians, industrialists, and bureaucrats who were increasingly willing to embrace high modernist visions of technocratic authoritarianism. Second, historians are re-examining, this is my second point about historians re-examining the Great Depression, they're re-examining the role of globalization and the Great Depression by reconsidering the purpose and impact of autarkic policies. Scholars increasingly view autarkic policies and even variations on Roosevelt's New Deal as improvised responses to the economic shockwaves of the 1930s, as opposed to sort of preordained plans or pre-prepared plans. These policies, in fact, did not amount to a full rejection of global engagement, they argue. After all, no industrial economy could possibly be completely self-sufficient. Indeed, most advocates of economic autarky aim to expand state controls and build regional trade blocs that could insulate national economies from global shocks and limit the power of international markets. It also sought to suspend international financial obligations, and in particular, Germany's obligation to pay war reparations. This political shift in the character of globalization helps explain how a globally respected figure like Germany's Heinrich Schacht could move from being a gold standard era central banker to serving as Hitler's financial architect. In the 1930s, efforts to shield national economies from global forces was driven not just by the need to stabilize industries, but also the imperative to rearm. By 1936-37, military production was a global phenomena, with spending nearly almost 3 times higher than in 1933. Demand and prices for industrial raw materials, particularly non-ferrous metals, had also surged. Economists at the League of Nations observed that armaments production had become one of the principal forces shaping international economic relations. Worldwide production figures for military hardware soared, particularly for military aircraft. And while it is common to analyze this intensifying military competition around rival doctrines, technologies, and strategies, I want to argue that when viewed in the aggregate, it actually constituted a form of globalization in its own right. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to view an arms race as a globalizing force, but it's difficult to describe the 1930s in any other way. All the major powers became locked in competition, ramping up armaments programs and reshaping their military strategies and force structures in relation to each other. Each state closely tracked the capabilities and intentions of each other, and whether allies or potential enemies, in fact. This vigilance reinforced an increasingly interconnected system of military and economic interaction and action and reaction cycles. If global history is about the movement of ideas and their impact across borders, then the 1920s and 30s offers a powerful example, a striking convergence in military thought. The experience of the First World War had convinced strategists worldwide that future wars would demand the full mobilization of both people and resources. This understanding was shaped not only by their own national experiences, but also by a close reading and study of each other's military theories, official histories, and military publications. According to them, the lessons of the First World War was very clear. Victory would go to the powers that could quickly convert their civilian industries to arms production and which possessed secure access to food and raw materials. Driven by a doctrine that imagined nations as war machines, military planners emerged as the quintessential high modernists of the era. Their theory of victory rested on industrial strategy. Staff officers analyzed economic data to optimize mobilization, while intelligence officials identified enemy supply chains vulnerable to blockades and bombing. High modernist theories of war blurred the boundaries between the civilian and military spheres and between peacetime and wartime. The principal effect of the global arms race was to draw the great powers into a competitive cycle of economic and military mobilizations, even in the absence of open conflict. In the critical years 1939 to 1941, the arms race prompted urgent now or never decisions about waging war. The result was not a series of regional conflicts and confrontations, but a single global conflict about the future hierarchy and institutional order of the world. Now, by way of conclusion, I've argued that the world wars were not an interruption to globalization, but one of its central dynamics. The framework I've proposed focuses on the interplay between population politics, the widespread influence of high modernism, and adversarial resource politics. It helps to explain how globalization intensified or expanded the geographic scope of the war and intensified the violence, and also the totalizing character of the Second World War. This approach highlights the value of global history. It also shows that the major conflicts of the early 20th century grew out of the very structures and tensions created by globalization. The final question is, what does this global history of the Second World War portend for our own period of rising great power competition and uncertainty? To begin answering that, I want to highlight one key point. There is a striking similarity between the unwarranted optimism of globalization enthusiasts after 1919 and the optimism that emerged in the 1990s. In June 1931, for example, the renowned British historian Arnold J. Toynbee gave a speech at the League of Nations in Geneva about the major trends shaping the post-1919 world. He argued that economic integration would inevitably lead to a single world economy, a united global culture, and lasting peace. Similarly, globalization enthusiasts in the early 1990s spoke in glowing terms about an inevitable future shaped by Francis Fukuyama's famous end of history thesis, the Washington Consensus, and the unipolar moment. In both cases, the optimism was not only misplaced, but it also failed to account for the complexity and often contradictory nature of global developments. Take the internet, for example. In the 1990s, it was hailed as the information superhighway, a tool for democracies, for spreading democracy, spreading reliable knowledge, and boosting economic growth as a consequence. But over time, it became a platform for spying, propaganda, disinformation, and a powerful driver of transnational cultural wars and radicalization. It is worth considering how these downsides might have been managed had serious questions about the security architecture and impact on national sovereignty, an impact of the internet on national sovereignty had been raised at the time. And it is exactly these kinds of questions we should be asking about, today, and not just about the AI revolution, but also about the emerging struggle to control the planet's AI infrastructure. Another striking parallel is the political and intellectual response after the Great Depression and also after the 2008 financial crisis. Of course, the Great Depression was far larger in scale and impact, and it very quickly shifted political debates towards a future world order shaped by big block economies, high modernist social engineering, and state capitalism. The impact of the 2008 crisis, combined with the China shock and the COVID-19 pandemic, took longer to unfold. Still, it pushed the political and intellectual debates, it has pushed political and intellectual debates in a similar direction, towards increased state intervention in the economy and a growing crisis of confidence amongst liberal thinkers and liberal intellectuals. And a sense of the crisis and where solutions are being sought emerges when reading, for example, Dan Wang's book, Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future, alongside Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's Abundance: How We Build a Better Future. And Klein and Thompson are American liberal intellectuals associated with the New York Times. Now, of course, these books have been criticized as gross oversimplifications of complex issues, but much like similar works in the 1930s and 40s, which, by the way, also oversimplified complex issues, they reflect a broader trend towards state capitalism. The trend, and one might speculate, might be further accelerated by another financial crisis, this time centered on the risky reinvention of money through cryptocurrencies. Finally, it is worth reflecting on one last parallel between the 1920s and our own time, namely the belief that great power rivalry had faded. It was assumed that old wars between states would be replaced by new wars, conflicts involving transnational actors, or civil wars within failed states. Today, however, it is increasingly common to declare that great power politics is back and that arms and alliances are once again the central focus of international affairs. This political shift raises urgent questions about the dangers of arms races and the risks that regional conflicts could escalate into something far bigger. And while it is tempting to draw direct comparisons or analogies between today's great power politics and that of the 1930s and 40s, such analogies, I think, can often be misleading. For one thing, I don't see the makings of a global arms race yet, I should say, like the one that accompanied the coming of the Second World War. We are seeing arms buildups, technological rivalries, and autonomous systems, and regional competitions. The likely end of the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, is a heavily armed East-West divide again in Europe. The greatest risks, in my mind, lie in the destabilizing potential of new technologies amid a crisis between nuclear-armed powers, such as the one that took place in May 2025 between India and Pakistan. We are, however, seeing an intensification of what I had called earlier adversarial resource politics. In other words, efforts to leverage economic independence in strategic minerals, such as rare earths and their processing, as well as in computer chips and even data for AI for geopolitical advantage, alongside efforts to neutralize or limit such leverage. The proliferation of economic weapons appears to be reshaping the global economy into large economic blocs and competing trade, data, energy corridors. Examples include China's Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the US-led India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. Although many observers in the 1930s warned that trade wars would trigger blood wars, there is no inevitable relationship between the two. What we are perhaps witnessing is globalization shifting in a new direction that can, in fact, accommodate a return to great power rivalries. The emerging form of globalization will likely be multipolar in structure and support a mixture of geostrategic and market arrangements, what some scholars have begun to describe as a new era of plurilateralism. That this form of globalization will look very different from that of the 1990s should not in itself be a cause for alarm. And I'll end it there. So thank you very much.